Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all. Thank you so much for coming out today. For the second in this semester's series of tgiFHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute's Friday morning series that gives Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and the arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know our faculty here. There is no agenda or theme indicated in the series, no demand to be disciplinary or interdisciplinary, just to present the work that is on people's minds at this time. And we are returning to the format, our former format, having colleagues in our space for the kinds of intimate conversations to which we have become accustomed, or at least we were accustomed some years ago before we moved into the space of Zoom, which of course had some advantages, but doesn't really take the place of this form of relationality. This morning, I am very, very pleased to introduce Mark Anthony Neal, who is James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies, English and Gender Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. You'll have to forgive me for going on a bit here, but Mark is the author of 6 monographs, so I might have to go on a little bit, one of which, New Black Man, was reissued in a 10th anniversary edition in 2015. His first, What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Black Public Culture, investigates the link between popular music and concepts of community in the Black diaspora from the 1940s to the present, that is, till 1998 when it was published. And he documents the way in which migration out of the southern US into the north in the post-war period shifted style, for example, in the ways in which covert counter-hegemonic double entendre designed to resist oppression created communal ties. The impetus to write up north, he explains, was somewhat different, reflecting the problems of urban migrants and their communal aspirations shaped by, quote, migration patterns, dearth or abundance of public venues, national and local political movements, Black religious institutions, Black youth culture, the corporate annexation of Black popular culture, crack cocaine, class stratification within the Black community, gender relations, police brutality, the structural and economic transformation of urban space. All these shaped musical production, both thematically and stylistically, responding to renewal and possibility on the one hand, poverty and unemployment and the circulation of drugs on the other. And starting with bebop and coming all the way to hip-hop, Professor Neal provides a grand sweep in his analysis of diverse musical styles as responses to urban change and political movement. His second monograph hones in on a particular era and legacy: Soul Babies, Contemporary Black Popular Culture and the Post-Soul Aesthetic from 2002, centers on the legacy of the 1960s, its idealism, activism, and cultural production for Black Americans who came of age during the 70s and 80s. He addresses how what he calls the post-soul generation has negotiated history, memory, and identity through the music of the children of soul, born after the 1963 March on Washington and before the challenges to affirmative action in 1978. The music was characterized by, he suggests, a desire to keep things real while succeeding within the mainstream, a commitment to an ethic of self-criticism, as well as to the reconstruction of community, the ability to question heterosexist patriarchal norms while referencing the iconic and artistic productions of the elders, and an eagerness to appropriate vulgar representations of Blackness, as it were, in order to question them, indeed deconstruct them. In Songs in the Key of Black Life, Professor Neal similarly addresses the relationship between socio-economic conditions and musical production, and addresses such issues as gender and the manner in which there were constraints placed on Black radio, for example, during the era of hyper-conglomeration about, quote, the music that gets played, or rather the music that is never played on commercial radio stations that specialize in so-called urban formats. As if taking this cue about questions of gender formation in New Black Man, Rethinking Black Masculinity, the numerous ways men suffer the consequences of patriarchy and stand to benefit from feminist analysis, as well as activists' emphasis on social change, becomes the central focus. I am not the new black man, Neal writes, but rather the new black man is a metaphor for an imagined life, strong commitment to diversity in our communities, strong support for women and feminism, and strong faith in love and value of listening. He goes on to analyze modern cultural instances that exemplify the antithesis of the new black man, moments of sexism, homophobia, and violence, which Professor Neal elegantly contextualizes and analyzes through an impressive variety of critical lenses. He's no apologist for any kind of misogyny, but considers the manner in which criticism of misogyny has its own ends, as it were, particularly the criticism of the misogyny of hip-hop music and videos that is used to deflect from the embedded patriarchal privilege of older black configurations and of various religious contexts that attempt to make their followers equate support for African American community with an adherence to notions of male dominance. Hip-hop's misogynistic strand is thus tackled from a number of different angles, but also it provides insight into how one might resist. The feminist analysis continues through looking for Leroy, illegible black masculinities, in which Professor Neal takes as his starting point the seductive figure of the character of Leroy from the TV series Fame, and through him he considers the various dichotomies of representations of black masculinity, from poor and often criminal to elite and sometimes criminal, from hypermasculine, sometimes criminal, to queer, sometimes violent, the good and the bad, all dichotomies that nonetheless allow for ideas of criminality and violence to persist. His most recent Black Ephemera, The Crisis and Challenge of the Archive, which appeared a few months ago, addresses the creation and neglect of various black archives. While on the one hand, publishers like Harvard University Press and academics like Henry Louis Gates have focused on large archival projects, music, arguably, as he puts it, the thread that runs through Black life, is reduced to ephemera often, a stack of vinyls in the corner. He writes, though Black Ephemera is largely concerned with the Black archive, the catalogue of an iconic Black music label, the historical and contemporary iterations of Black women's trauma in popular culture, Black mourning as rendered in digital and analog culture, the Great American Songbook as redefined by legendary Black musical artists, and the abstracting of the Black archive, it remains tethered to music as its primary source, he writes. While one might think of Black music, he says, as the historical lingua franca of Blackness, my concern is that Black music itself has actually been reduced to, at best, ephemera, like a stack of vinyl albums in a closet, and at worst, the ambient background of the continued exploitation and commodification of Black culture. Now, I'm very conscious of my own media and scholarly bias here in describing Mark Anthony Neal's monographs. He has, in addition, edited volumes, which I'm not going to talk about at the moment, numerous articles. He has blogs, and the tremendous series Left of Black, which I'm proud to now have under FHI's umbrella in the capable hands of Mark Anthony Neal with Eric Barstow and others who Mark has brought into the fold of that extraordinary program in which we really can become educated in Black critical thought from the last 10 and a half years now, I think, 11 maybe. His multimedia presence can perhaps be summed up in his role as director of the Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship. At Duke, he is James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies. He is also professor of English and Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. He serves as chair of the Department of African and African American Studies. And today, his talk is titled The Love Languages of Black Fatherhood. Please join me in welcoming him.
For that wonderful introduction. It's so good to see good friends here in the audience today. I got to make sure to, once this posts a video, that I take that clip and use you, Ranji. It's kind of like a sizzle reel for myself. Thank you, Ranji, for the invitation. Thank you, obviously, for this wonderful space. Thank you to the memory and the spirit of John Hope Franklin that inspires this space. I gotta always give a shout out to Eric Barstow, who's shooting here today. And I know he hates when I do this, but he joined Left the Black in February of 2020 and helped us pivot into the world of COVID production. And now that that's over, we're now back in the world in really kind of extraordinary ways, shooting, remotely in all kinds of different places. So I do want to thank Eric for what is a kind of labor that often gets overlooked. I think sometimes when we think about folks who do the work that Eric does, just stand there and point the camera and capture it. And he really presents so much more. What I'm going to read today is the opening chapter from a project called The Love Languages of Black Fatherhood. It's a trade book. It's intended to be plain spoken. But it really is a kind of combination of critical memoir, media analysis, and media criticism, and engaging some of the popular social science research being done on Black families and Black fathers in particular. One of my favorite photos of my dad, who was not one for taking pictures or smiling in them when he did, is of his 6-foot frame hovering over the hot griddle of the Brooklyn drugstore and diner where he worked for 15 years. In his element, where the griddle skills were affirmed as something that he did exceedingly well, the picture of my father is in his own context. A world of so-called unskilled Black men for whom the lowest rung of entry into the workforce was considered an achievement, and rightfully so. It was the difference between my family eating or going hungry in more ways than I understood at the time. We were fed. I was 8 years old when my father handed me my first spatula. The assignment on that Sunday morning in 1973 was a hard fried egg. The following week we moved on to pancakes, and soon I was the veteran of the fried bologna sandwich. Food, or rather the cooking of food, was one of my father's love languages. I still think of him whenever I make myself an egg sandwich. Yet because my father worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, that meant he mainly had time for himself and for me and my mother, his wife, 1 day a week and 1 day only, Sundays. Even when Dad brought his work home, slices of beef brisket, pastrami and corned beef, wrapped in foil and greasy paper bags, that were nothing less than a treat. It was lost on me as a child how much my father enjoyed what he did. It was a running joke in my parents' house that my father was my mother's dishwashing machine, one of those duties on the job that paid his hourly wage. But it was the Sunday morning ritual of making breakfast and listening to music that grounded us as a family. Dad lingered at the breakfast table of our 700 square foot apartment, drinking 2 or 3 cups of black, sweet coffee, and smoking 2 or 3 Pall Malls, his nicotine sticks of choice. Dad liked his A's runny so that he could soak up the remaining yolk in the tower of white bread stacked on his plate. He preferred smoked sausage to bacon, and grits were, of course, a staple. If the white bread was some representation of my dad's heartiness, his laugh was infectious and he laughed more than he smiled, the runny eggs were the very opposite of his demeanor. My mom always described him as slow, slow in that southern, seemingly unbothered way, but he was deliberate, using language sparsely as a way to hide evidence of his Thompson, Georgia upbringing and the limits of his 10th grade education. The Sunday morning soundtrack included The Mighty Clouds of Joy, Sam Cooke and the Soul Stirrers, and the Swanee Quintet. After Dad washed the dishes and mopped the floor, he'd settle down in the living room, the closest thing to a domestic sanctuary for a few hours of reflection, I assume, as the groups got a little denser via the Hammond B3 brothers, Jimmy McGriff and Jimmy Smith. Later on Sundays in the spring and summer, we watched New York Met games on Channel 9. A good Sunday if Tom Seaver, Jerry Kuzman, or John Matlack were taking the mound. It was the time that we talked the most. Conversation became the most animated when I was about 6 years old, and my father's own baseball hero, Willie Mays, was traded to the New York Mets from the San Francisco Giants. The Giants were the franchise that made Mays a national star as a say-hey kid, first in New York, Harlem really, and then San Francisco when the team moved there after the 1957 season, 2 years before my father arrived in New York City. Mays' trade to the Mets was a homecoming of sorts for my dad. It was if we were, for the first time we watched the games, sharing a boyhood. Where monstrous home runs and swing and miss strikeouts at a critical point of the game is what keep novice fans in tune. For my dad, it was the small things. Executing a perfect bunt, the exquisite hit and run play, and of course a pitcher with pinpoint control who could paint the corners. My dad was never one who was on the nose with these things. The big message was that with effort and talent, life was a game of nuance and mishaps. Baseball, like life, is mainly a game of failure. The best batters often fail 70% of the time, making it a game in which failure is a feature and not a bug. For my dad, teaching his son not simply how to play the game, but the strategy behind it, became the way of sharing with me the failure embedded in Black fatherhood, malehood, and success. While there were occasions where he took me out to the park to play catch, most of the time Dad and I sat in front of our first color TV and watched the New York Mets, who were often spectacularly hapless and equally spectacular when they reached the greatest heights of the sport. I was a toddler when the Mets won the World Series in 1969, and I was away at college when they won in 1986. But the 1973 series, which the Mets lost, encapsulate much of what my father taught me through baseball. In the 10th inning of Game 2, still the longest ever in the history of the World Series, clocking in at over 4 hours, the home plate umpire called out the Mets shortstop Bud Harrelson. Dad leapt from his chair angrily and paced behind it for a few moments. The call was bad. Everyone conceded, including Mays, who raced to home and engaged the umpire before he dropped to his knees. It's an iconic photo, begging the official to reconsider the call. The Say Hey Kid, a player who inspired generations of American fans with how he roamed center field like a field general and ran the base paths with a controlled abandon, his cap flying off his head, was gone. Another player, a lesser one at 42 years old, in the prone position, petitioning, had shrunk into the young hero's place. My dad, who was only 4 years younger than Mays, may have felt well past his prime. Early in that same World Series game, Mays badly misplayed a fly ball in center field, stumbling to the ground, the clearance evidence that his body was beginning to betray him. Indeed, my dad had already metaphorically stumbled more times than I could possibly know, and his own body would betray him several times before his death. Born in 1935 in the largely Black community of Thompson, Georgia, my father, Arthur Cleveland Neal Jr., was the baby of Arthur Cleveland Sr. and Cleo's 5 children. Because of Thompson's size, my father always told folks he was from Augusta, which is 30 miles to the east. Though NFL Hall of Fame punter Ray Guy is the most famous person from the city, the most black famous person from Thompson was the raunchy R&B and country singer Millie Jackson. Most of my father's family and friends just called Dad AC, including my mother. I was named Mark Anthony, apparently in tribute to my fraternal grandmother Cleo, who died when my dad was 5 years old. Mark Anthony, Cleopatra, get it? Though almost everyone called me AC's boy, Tony. As a member of the so-called silent generation, my father's life was framed by the Depression era in which he was born into, and always already a depression for black folk in the Jim Crow South. The World War II years and the boom economy of the 1950s, which catapulted blacks leaving the South in search of jobs and opportunity to other regions of the country. At 24, my father followed his older siblings, Lorraine, Virginia, and Lamar, to New York City, where he found work as a dishwasher, hospital porter, and eventually a shorter to cook. Lorraine's husband, Harvey, helped him navigate the big city. As a functional illiterate, Dad's ability to remember the details that might be inconsequential to so many others helped him navigate a large city of signs and directions which he could only read on the most basic of levels. My dad lived with Virginia, who introduced him to her co-worker, Elsie Robinson. Herself a recent transplant to New York City from Baltimore, Elsie and Arthur were married in Baltimore on September 15th, 1963. A day remembered in tragic infamy because of the murders of four little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wellesley, and the maiming of a fifth, Sarah Collins, all aged between 11 and 14, at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And the day before the wedding, my mother dealt with her own tragedy of sorts when her father revealed that her letters to him and the months leading up to their wedding went unanswered because he couldn't read them. My mother decided to go ahead with the marriage. She jokingly revealed it to me as a young adult because my dad had good hair. Her humor and cheekiness aside, my mother's telling of this tense period, it pulsated with disappointment and even betrayal. Black middle class expectations were central to my mother's own aspirational upbringing. Unable to meet those expectations with her choice of a partner, Mom surpassed them as a parent. The byproduct of my father's limited literacy was that my mother filled our apartment with reading materials. I remember vividly the day the white encyclopedia salesman showed up at the house. Not so rare, since it was still an era where there were a few stray white folks in the Morrisania section of the South Bronx. Weeks later, the Britannica, the Junior Britannica, and the Children's Britannica encyclopedias were delivered. And I made ample use of all three well into my college years. My mother despised comic books, a source of the devil, she said, even in our decidedly non-religious household, but allowed me to choose my own reading materials, right? For instance, with a subscription of Baseball Digest. It was in this world of reading that I discovered Angela Davis, H. Rap Brown, and even Malcolm X on my mother's bookshelf. What this circumstance practically guaranteed is that my father couldn't ever follow me into the world of reading and literacy that my mother had created for me. But it would be my father's world of music that became the center of what I write, teach, and research. My father had erected his own world of literacy in those hundreds of albums that he amassed in our living room. The brass stand, which contained 4 rows of his cherished 33 and a third vinyl, was like a holy grail, separate and distinct from the stack of single 45s that were my mother's. Dad was protective of those albums, and I was instructed at a very young age not to disturb them. Dad was protective, I often eavesdropped on his listening sessions, so often in the dark, with only the glow of his burning Pall Malls and the glint of the pint bottle of Johnny Walker Red visible. There were no man caves in these days, and certainly not in our small South Bronx apartment, but that dark living room with its standard issue Negro era plastic furniture covering was a site of retreat. It was with the music that my father managed the challenges of his world, seeking salve and moments of unvarnished joy in the rich harmonic structures of those gospel singers. When the spirit hit him, and it happened more often than not, I could hear him groaning. He really couldn't sing. The lyrics of songs like The Soul Stirrers, That's Heaven to Me. A little flower that blooms in May. A lovely sunset at the end of the day. Someone helping a stranger along the way because that's heaven to me. Reflected Dad's devotional practice to the everydayness of life here and now. Those Sunday afternoons with his music, his brown liquor, and his feelings were his heaven. In the uttering of those lyrics, I also heard his hopes for my own survival and success. The former never to be guaranteed, words that he could never really express directly to me. But something seemed to liven up my dad, but nothing seemed to liven up my dad more than the Mighty Clouds of Joy. Their singer, Joe Lagan, and in particular, their album Live at the Concert Hall. I've listened to that live album hundreds of times, many of those times sitting within the earshot of my entranced father. And of course, this was back in the day when folks didn't have turntables, but record players. So my father often let that first side of Live at the Concert Hall play over and over again. He listened to the first side so much that when I hear the album today, it recalls a singular memory in my mind, that of my father getting up to do his version of the holy dance. Never the most agile of men, something he definitely passed on to his son. My father's version of the holy dance, a one-footed stomping affair like one might stomp a roach or two when the lights come on, with almost Frankenstein-like finger-snapping gestures, was very different than the dance he did while listening to Jimmy Smith, B.B. King, Jimmy McGriff, though most of the time he listened to his music in a sort of gangster lean. Whenever the Mighty Clouds of Joy sang, I Came to Jesus, he was up on his feet. As a boy, I cherish those experiences as I do those memories now, though for many of my school-age neighborhood friends, my father was invisible, a literal shadow figure who headed to Brooklyn before dawn and returned home in the dark. What father you got? I was challenged on more than a few occasions as if my dad were in prison or worse, just simply absent. I always understood that there was a joke attached to these queries. A bunch of black boys sharpening our rhetorical knives, playing the dozens, knowing that we at least needed to know how to talk shit if we were never going to be shit. In all likelihood, the grown men in our lives were low-hanging fruit. Still, I felt the sting of those quips. It was even more personal when one of my first crushes asked my best friend to find out if I had a father at home. Understand, this girl was a template for every girl and woman who would have my heart afterwards, including my wife. Skin on that spectrum of honey roasted to pecan tan, with a bottom-heavy, ample frame and a mix of innocent forthrightness that I always found alluring. Yet the query about my dad felt as though I was being evaluated on the basis of whether or not I came from the proverbial broken home, and thus unacceptable. To be sure, there were a few neighborhood cats whose fathers actually didn't live with them. But there were also black men, other black men folk, uncles, older brothers, their moms, boyfriends, grandfathers, who were in their lives. They were by no means abandoned and uncared for. Growing up in the working class neighborhoods where most of the middle-aged men worked long menial hours like my dad, the men that we saw most regularly in public were often young, just beyond their teenage years, black male adults, often unemployed and living on the fringes of criminality, corner boys and wannabe gangbangers. If they were fathers, they were young fathers likely alienated from the mothers of their children, though there was likely an infrastructure in place of grandmothers, aunties, and older adult men who were on the case. It takes a village wasn't just a meme or a campaign slogan. It was those nuances of the Black family that were often missing in popular commentaries. Instead, many Black children of my era viewed and took to heart media-fueled fantasies about Black families in which art imitated public policy, imitating bad sociology. In the minds of the children, we see what we don't see doesn't exist. And what so many of us saw, at least I did in the 1970s, were images of fatherhood on television and film that didn't quite jive with what we experience in our lives, but were powerful nevertheless. Triggered by the loss of a TV father figure, my first existential crisis occurred when I was about 10. James Evans Sr., portrayed by John Amos, was the patriarch of the sitcom Good Times, which debuted in January of 1974. The series was notable as one of the first sitcoms that attempted to portray a realistic view of the Black urban poor, life in the ghetto, as it were. Although Good Times was often rife with racial stereotypes, the presence of a strong patriarch made it popular among Black audiences, particularly as Amos's patriarch was a foil to the show's breakout star Jimmy Walker, who at times was in direct lineage to figures like Stephen Fetchard and Mantan Moreland. In James Evans Sr., I saw for the first time and witnessed a character on television like my dad, hardworking and dedicated to his family despite a limited education, sixth grade in this instance. Evans wasn't rich like George Jefferson from the Jeffersons. He wasn't old like Fred Sanford from Sanford and Son. Unlike my dad, Evans often wore his emotions on his sleeve, providing an alternative example of Black fatherhood beyond the cool pose, the stoicism, that defines so many performances of Black masculinity on and off the screen. There was no small irony that because of the show's initial 8 p.m. hour, the exact time my dad was leaving his job in Brooklyn, that we never watched the show together. After a contract dispute between the show's producers and the actor John Amos, the character James Sr. was written off Good Times. James Evans Sr.'s death, revealed in the fall of 1976 in the season premiere, had me in my feelings because it was up to that point that I had never considered my parents' own mortality. Yet, as I thought about the fragility of my parents' lives, motivated albeit by a fictional television character, it was the fear of the loss of my mother that most crept into my psyche. Of course, in the nature of our household, it was my mother who largely shaped my emotional intellect. She lacked an emotional filter. And I was always close to those emotions as a proverbial mama's boy. It was a connection that my father, to the best of my knowledge, neither sought nor desired with me. In that sense, the so-called absence of the Black father was, for me, always more emotional than it ever was physical. And I might suggest the former might be the more difficult of the two. On the other hand, as a kid, I can remember when the magic of syndication made Robert Young and Father Knows Best, Single Dead and Widower Fred McMurray and My Three Sons, and Robert Reed and the Brady Bunch household staples, each one embodying a version of the perfect father. They all shared a consistent routine. They were always home for dinner by 6 p.m., and it was at the dinner table where they would, with a jurisprudence typically reserved for Supreme Court justices, adjudicate the daily travails within the family. Embedded in these images was an idealized view of whiteness, the white family, white masculinity, and a middle-class version of the American dream. But for us, those images worked as a dark mirror, rendering our family arrangements and parental expressions pathological. While all white TV dads delivered eloquent soliloquies about basic kindness and fairness offered up as common shared values, there was an economy to my dad's words, as if he understood that he would be more effective showing me how to live a productive life as opposed to telling me about it. My dad could be gregarious, especially with other black men folk like himself, working class, recent migrants from the South, immigrants in the Caribbean. But for me, it was often simply gestures. And he listened to his talkative son and that laugh of his. Yet there was a sting of my father missing every school play, every musical recital, every choir performance. My father didn't even attend my college graduation. To think of black fathers in America is to think of an absence rather than a presence. Ironically, in 20th century America, I grew up with nonstop images of white men who were considered successful precisely because of the hours they spent away from their families. Before the publication of the document formerly titled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, and popularly known as the Moynihan Report in 1965, the year of my birth, there had been very little language available outside of intimate black life to describe and define black parents and families. Black families were mostly a collective absence in the American cultural vernacular until Daniel Patrick Moynihan, an obscure sociologist and Assistant Secretary of Labor in the then President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, filled the vacuum. In the midst of Johnson's policy for a great society, Moynihan independently thought it important to link the rising unemployment rates among black men to what he perceived as an emerging pathology. Rooted in a so-called female-dominated black household, what he described as a fatherless, matrilocal, mother-centered pattern, linked to, among other things, slavery. The report was given some credibility when portions of it appeared in President Johnson's landmark commencement address at Howard University in June of 1965. In Johnson's so-called to fulfill these rights, he offered, in far too many ways, American Negroes have been another nation, deprived of freedom, crippled by hatred, the doors of opportunity closed to hope. Acknowledging the historical reality of racism and disenfranchisement in this instance. But with the phrase, "but freedom is not enough," there was a caveat. Quote, "Perhaps most important, its influence radiating every part of life is the breakdown of the Negro family structure." And it is here that Johnson doubled down on the insights provided by Moynihan, noting only a minority, less than a half, of all Negro children reach the age of 18 having lived all their lives with both of their parents. And then the tug at the proverbial heartstrings. At this moment, tonight, little than 2/3 are at home with both of their parents. One can only imagine what the assembly of black elites and black middle-class aspirants. Howard University is one of the premier historically black institutions in the country and would educate a future vice president of the United States 2 decades later, thought of Johnson's address. All the thoughts of white America, who at the very time of Johnson's speech were watching popular fare on television like Bonanza, the #1 show in America during 1964 and 1965, which featured a middle-aged patriarch running his expansive Nevada farm, along with his 3 adult sons, whose 3 different mothers had all died. Further down the ratings, but still in the top 5 of viewership, was the Andy Griffith Show, about a sheriff in a small North Carolina town raising his only son with the help of his elderly aunt. In this fictional town of Mayberry, even the town drunk Otis had a regular job. Under difficult and likely tragic situations, these fathers were extended grace both in the context of their series, the fictional worlds, and the real one. Such grace would rarely be extended to black fathers. It's also important to note that these TV series were about single fathers raising boys, a vision of white family life central to the 20th century American imagination was essentially a mom-free zone, contrary to the idea of the black family that Moynihan popularized, where the centering of the black mother actually served to marginalize and pigeonhole black women in larger culture. Leaked to the press, the Moynihan report was in the hands of many journalists when the so-called watch riots broke out in 1965. The stimulus for the violence that spread across the Watts district in Los Angeles for 5 days in 1965 was as familiar as it was absurd. On August 11, 1965, a hot, sweltering Wednesday afternoon, Marquette Fry, a 21-year-old black man, was pulled over by the LAPD for suspicion of drunk driving. Such stops were not unusual and were part of the largest practice of police harassment experienced by black residents during the reign of LAPD Chief William H. Parker, who later referred to the so-called rioters as monkeys in a zoo. As Fry was detained, a crowd began to congregate and tensions rose. Fry's mother, Rena, showed up at the scene chastising him. "I told you about drinking and driving," as Marquette recalled himself in an interview with reporter Michael Szymanski in 1986. All hell broke loose, though, when the officer forcibly pulled Rena from her son and Marquette was hit in the face with a baton. The mother and son both arrested. The scene became ground zero for the Watts riots. While there were some who were apt to ask where Marquette Fry's father was, a Wall Street Journal front page headline from August 16, 1965, framed that query in a way that would define the discourse on black fathers for generations. Quote, "Behind the riots, family life breakdown in Negro slums sow seeds of race violence. Husbandless homes spawn young hoodlums, impede reform," unquote. That some of the older adult men in the black community might have actually been at work doing the same 10 hours and 6 days a week that my father did occurred to few reporting on the violence. Moynihan effectively stamped black mothers, in reality as single and matriarchal, giving rise to the idea that the normal state of black fatherhood was absence. In his worldview, the black mother stood alone in the home and the black father stood apart from the home. The black superwoman, the angry black woman, the black woman who can't keep a man, the welfare queen, were seeded so completely into mainstream culture that either black fathers who lived at the mercy of an unrelenting different work schedules like mine did, so their cultural reputations and representations joined with men who actually had abandoned their families. Because of Moynihan, when I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, if my father wasn't present, then he was labeled as absent. What I didn't have to counter this idea that even other black folks held was the language to describe my father's presence. Invisible to whiteness, these languages raised and nurtured and imbued many of us with a deep and abiding sense of our Father's love, regardless of how imperfect or different they were from white middle-class images of fatherhood, or similar, as in my case with baseball. Black fatherhood has a legible language of love and commitment and care. Rendering black fatherhood visible and tangible means learning to hear this language. There's a difference to be made between being present and being invisible. And that's a fine line that two other black fathers of a certain generation tread, and not without consequence. The whole of the culture, including black folks ourselves, mistook Moynihan's grossly limiting labels for the members of the black family as language that actually described black people and how we relate to each other within our families. A label is a designation. Language is a system of communication. For far too long, including black folks ourselves, we mistook Moynihan's labels for a language and actually started to recognize ourselves in the stereotypes. By the time I became a father, I was filled with decades of anxiety and apprehension about what it meant to be a good father, a good black father. And it's not as if I had a clear blueprint for what being a good father looked like. Some of what I felt was as much the natural emotions of a new parent. Indeed, I was born in an era which featured very traditional notions of fatherhood. And by the time I became a dad myself in the late 1990s, the idea of a more malleable role for dads, some becoming so called stay at home dads, and virtually all of these examples seemed to fit for upper and middle class white fathers. But for me, there was a specter, a ghost, one that was largely absent in the consciousness of my white peers, that of the failed black father. Never so much the father I could be, but always the father that I couldn't allow myself to become. It's difficult not to see Moynihan and his report as authors of the state. When I look back to the example of my own father, I saw a man of a few words but a few hundred albums. When I didn't know what to say to the baby girl I was charged with helping move through the world, Marvin and Tammy were always the obvious choice. Since I could sing Marvin's part softly in her ear, by the time when she was a year old, she had her own first official mixtape. I can still hear B.B. Winans' In Harm's Way and Curtis Mayfield's Miss Black America in her nursery. What I took from my father's example, so different from those white TV dads, was the expression of black culture as an act of love. Though music played an important part of my father's life, he found his spiritual grounding in those records. It was rarely something that we did together. Though my own love of records as a collector and later a scholar were firmly rooted in my father's love of music. In the 40-something years my father and I shared the earth together, we never said a mumbling word that came anywhere close to the phrase, I love you. Just thinking about it brings mind to an exchange between Troy Maxson and his son Corey and August Wilson's Fences, where the latter asked his father, a decidedly difficult and taciturn man, how come you never liked me? To which Troy shoots back, like you? Who the hell says I got to like you? What law is there say I got to like you? You live in my house, sleep on my bedclothes, fill your belly up on my food, because you're my son, you my flesh and blood, not because I like you. We would be apt to describe Troy Maxson as a classic example of toxic masculinity, and perhaps rightfully so for the contemporary vantage point. But for my father's generation of black men and their sons in particular, Troy's response were all too real, born of a common sense notion that the role and expectations of what the role and expectations of black men were as fathers. Who the hell cares whether your father loves you if he provides for you? And indeed, the only expectations for black men of a certain generation were that they were providers and disciplinarians. And it's largely in the context of failing to do so that black fathers, which is to say black men, were deemed worthless. The tethering of black fatherhood to black manhood would further reduce black male humanity to the labor they provided: work, discipline, insemination. Love had nothing to do with it. Yet, it didn't mean that black fathers didn't love their children. And for that matter, that they didn't have feelings. Troy might not have liked Corey, that much is true, but he did express love for him. Like so many mid-20th century black fathers, Troy's love language was the example of a day's work. Troy's work ethic was his gift to Corey. 30 years ago, Gary Chapman posited this idea of the 5 love languages: words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, gifts, physical touch. All of which might seem obvious to the point of cliche, but the framework is useful even with its blind spots with regards to race, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality and class. I was well into adulthood and a father in my own right when I fully recognized that value. At this point, my father was suffering from the MS that had kept him immobile from his waist down and would keep him in a wheelchair bound until his death in 2008. My mother had an opportunity to travel with a group of friends to Atlantic City She needed someone to stay with my dad for the day since his home care attendant wouldn't be able to be there that Saturday. The request from my mother was received as an imposition. Not only was I missing time with my own wife and daughter, but the drive down from Schenectady, where we were living at the time, and the time spent in my parents' technologically challenged apartment, this in the years before broadband, meant that I would have to sacrifice a full day of writing. It was this time in my life when I thought I was most like my dad. Nothing could get in the way of the righteous grind, or at least the dad who had revealed himself to me up to that point. I always thought that these were difficult times for my dad, no longer able to do many of the things that in my mind had defined him. Knowing our shared love of music, I packed a few CDs to listen, to pass the time because it was not like we were going to talk. Among them, a collection of songs by the Five Blind Boys of Mississippi, not to be confused with the more well-known Five Blind Boys of Alabama. We were quietly listening to an old-timey spiritual when my dad began to sing softly. I have a few more tears to shed. I have a few more burdens to bear. And he sang full-throated by the time he reached the chorus. Tell mother to save a seat. Save a seat for me because I am weary, Lord, I'm so tired. The force of my father's singing shocked me in that moment, but in those lyrics from Save a Seat for Me, I not only saw the old man who had raised me, and whose time was shorter than any of us knew, but perhaps for the first time, the child who had lost his mother by the age of 5, and who navigated the world with the same stoicism of the father who had lost his wife. Not all love languages can be encased in a lovely bow. They are not all happy, and in some cases, many are in fact fueled by self-hatred, violence, as well as sorrow. I've watched videos on social media of black fathers disciplining their children, little boys getting punched in the chest and told to man up. And sadly, this is also a language of love, but a deeply wounded one. The leaked viral video of gospel singer Kirk Franklin lighting up his adult son is a reminder that black fathers in every walk of life struggle. We struggle with how to integrate and understand what happened in our childhoods with the fathers we wanted to be. We struggle with how to exercise power in a world that gives us power as men and then only takes it away because we're black. We struggle with how to love ourselves in a world that does not want us to succeed, and we struggle to love ourselves and see ourselves in our black wives and black children. Part of this struggle emerges from the fact that black men's love language is not always completely understood as such, even by our black children. This was true of my relationship to my father until I heard him sing his heart out that day in the wheelchair. Black fathers have always been on board with predominant definition of what it means to be a father. Monetarily provide for your children, but the goalpost has moved. Taking care of your kids is not just about food on the table and clothes on their back anymore. The definition of fatherhood has expanded to include considerable emotional and psychological support. These are currencies other than money, and black fathers had trouble buying into this idea because so many of our work lives simply make our being available unaffordable. My father could afford a family, which meant he spent very little time with his wife and child. Of course, I never loved my dad any less. What it meant is that our culture was unable to sufficiently recognize the value of black men like him. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
So, but I'm sorry. um, I just want to make a comment that a lot of what you're saying resonated with me. Um, and we bring like the childhood experiences, we bring all that stuff into adulthood. And I think it's kind of interesting when you see it being repeated in the next generation. So I don't know if you would respond to that comment. It's not really a question.
The one thing I will say, and this is part of the reason why I've taken on this project, I don't think enough black men talk about being the sons of fathers and what it means to be a father. And when we generally see narratives of black men talking about fatherhood, it's young black men, right, being challenged with the excitement that all comes with being a new father. There are very few narratives of what it means to be an older adult father reflecting back on fatherhood. And so part of what we're hoping to do with this project is to kind of stimulate these kind of conversations about what father is, right? And it's cut by class in really significant kinds of ways. It's obviously cut by region, religious practices. There's so many things that go into this idealized notion of black fatherhood. And I'm just hoping that we can unpack some of that, in really productive ways. So it's a book project called The Love Languages of Black Fathers. And I'm taking a look, again, using memoir, what I would call critical memoir. Also, media criticism, and looking at social science research on black families and black fathers to talk about the ways that black fathers father, right? Not using the standard white father as a stand-in as comparison, but literally looking how black fathers parent, right? And talking about what's good about that, what's bad about that, what can be better, and what are some of the challenges. One of the ongoing challenges for me in talking about this project, right? One, there is an element of shame associated with being a failed black father that bleeds into the fact that you can be a failed black partner, but you can't be a failed black father, right? And what does it mean that at some point your interpersonal relationship with a partner have to take a back seat to you performing some sort of notion of what an ideal black fatherhood is? It's also the mental health care dynamic of black men literally working themselves to death, right? Because the framework for black fathers to be fathers is make money, provide for your family, right? And if that means you have to be away from your home and your children for a significant amount of time, that's part of the sacrifice that you make in order to provide for your family. But we've had very little conversation about the consequences of that absence, right? So they're not absent in the household, right? But are they emotionally and psychologically available, right? One of the stories that I tell in the book, my youngest daughter began therapy at 12 years old. I started therapy 2 years later, in large part to figure out how to be a better parent to her. And so part of what I'm also talking about in this book is like, where do we find spaces of black men? And it's different now for a younger generation, but for my father's generation, right? The idea of going to therapy, right, as opposed to going to church, and that wasn't always an option either, right, it's unfathomable to them, right? So how much mental health crisis did they carry in their lives simply because it wasn't an outlet for them to describe those kinds of things? Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I just want to say that this is a very important work that you're doing. I also wrote a book that kind of addresses what you're talking about. And part of what I talk about is the whole notion of trying to find that balance between being present and providing. And in my book, I quote Music Soul Child, the song called Teach Me How to Love.
Yeah.
That's what's I find that's what's missing with Black fathers, because he says, I was always taught to go to work and provide. And that's just kind of it. So that balance of, as I say, being husband, father, provider, sensitive, loving protector, that other part of it gets lost. And then I think also how we define what's masculine and what's feminine, right? And I'm Muslim, by the way, so I kind of approach it through that lens. Sometimes we define being loving, being kind, being sensitive, and what our spiritual leader said, registering the feelings of others, we define that as being feminine. But it's not. It's actually a general human characteristic, right? But again, based on how we grew up, if we don't see that being modeled, then we grow up, like you said, we love our sons by saying, man up, toughen up. Right. You can't cry, you can't express your emotions, but it's something that's very natural, but they lose it early on because of the environment that they grow up in, because they're taught that to be sensitive, loving, feeling, to keep good company with people, that's defined as being feminine. So I love what you're doing, and it relates to the work that I've done. So keep up the great work. It's a very, very important topic.
You know, your reference to these kind of expressions of love, you know, one of the stories that I read, narratives that I read, that I didn't know was going to lead to this book that I read 20 years ago, was Qurbila Shabazz talking about her relationship with her father, Malcolm X. And she tells this story of, you know, he'd be at the kitchen table drinking his coffee, and, you know, and he's never around, right? So it was rare when he was home, right? Because he was on the road being Malcolm X all the time. And, you know, he's at the kitchen table and she comes up to him, and she might be 4 or 5 years old. And he goes, you know, Qurbila, I need a little sweetener in my coffee. Can you just swig your finger in my coffee cup? And it is such a beautiful image and sentiment, but one that is so out of line of what we think of when we think of Malcolm X. And that's part of what this work is, right? It's also an archival project. Let's go back into the archive, like the Music Soul Child reference, and think about the ways that these figures, even in popular culture, have been working through this process. There's a scene in Good Times that I'll eventually write about where his son, JJ, gets shot by a gangbanger, right? And he's in jail to see what kind of sentence the older father is sitting there seeing what kind of sentence the gangbanger is going to get. And his mother shows up, you know, smacks him in the head, all these kind of things. I'm through with you. And his reaction, James Evans Jr., Sr.'s reaction is, what kind of man am I that I feel empathy for the young man who shot my son? Right? And again, this is just a really kind of radical little sentiment in the context of how, first of all, we think about masculinity in general, but in this case, Black masculinity. Glenda?
Mark, this is so real, and so I feel so connected to this. And I want your thoughts on, my husband and I have one son, and you talked about the role of being provider and disciplinarian. And I want to bring up the role of protector, because my husband and I had so many disagreements about how to raise our son. And his trump card with me always was, I'm trying to raise a Black man to live in America. And so his thing was, he was very hard on my son, what I felt in an unnecessary way, but he was really acting out of fear. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if you address that in any way.
I think all Black parents, on some level, parent out of fear. Black men, Black fathers do so, one, out of a knowledge of what they experience. You know, for my father's generation, he had to parent me with the idea of growing up in the South, where reckless eyeballing was a real thing. You know, my father was 19 years old when Emmett Till was killed, right? For that generation of black men in particular, that's a narrative that resonated and colored their interactions with the world, right? We think interaction with white people, but no, it's really about how they comport themselves in the world. It's why we get these performances of stoicism, right? No kind of marked reaction to anything, right? So that you can kind of just, go through, without having to deal with any kind of contentious dynamics. And that's a problem, right? Because what I think gets lost, right? And it's not because, as you know, black fathers don't love their children, but they haven't found the freedom or been in a society that allowed them the freedom to parent with the fullness of themselves, right? And that, that's also part of what this book is, right? The way that black fathers are limited in the ways that they can parent because of the fact that they're limited in the ways they can be black men in society, right? And those things have to be in sync, right? So I can remember, and I was an adult, right, when my Aunt Virginia died, right? And she was the sibling that my dad was closest to. I was probably 22, 23 years old, just graduated from college. And watching him cry was disruptive to me because I didn't know what to do with that, right? That was nothing that I had ever connected to my own father, right? Or black men in general, right? And what it meant for me as a father, that when I got to those moments where I had to process, I'm about to lose it emotionally, right? And I have these two daughters around me, right? How do I do that, right? And for me, it was you do what you need to do emotionally in that moment, and then be able to explain to them why you had that release, right? So, watching the both of them, there was a moment, and I think I'm going to include this in the book, at my mother's funeral, and everybody had kind of left, and I lingered by the body. And one of my aunts whispered to my oldest daughter, who was 12 at the time, right, go get your father. Right? And she walked up to me, grabbed my hand, and walked me back to my seat. And on the one hand, it's like, okay, this is an amazing little girl, but also the fact that she saw me as a father in which she could do that, right, and not have to worry about any kind of retribution. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you for this nice talk. I'm not very familiar with I'm just a little bit familiar with the black culture in the US. But my question will be, like, on the emotional side, you say the father, they don't show emotion, they don't participate in the emotional upbringing of the children. So who bear that burden? I guess maybe the mothers. I don't know. But and then that goes to my other question, like, if mothers bear the emotional burden and all of that, like, what is the idealized, role of black mothers? We You just said like black fathers have to work hard to grind
Yeah.
to provide for their families, and then on the other side, how black mothers are seen culturally. Thank you.
Yeah. That's a great point. I think part of the negative byproduct of the Moynihan report is the way that it's demonized black mothers, right? Particularly when black mothers are forced to be in a role because of the legitimate absence of black fathers, of being provider and disciplinarian and all those things that we kind of assign. And the way that larger white society treats black mothers is that when we see young black people unhinged, right, engaged in the criminal element, ultimately the critique there, because it's always already assumed black fathers aren't present, what's already assumed that's a failure of black mothers and parenting. And it's weird because there was a moment when doing the Freddie Gray moment, when he's killed, and we have these protests afterwards, and it was a young black male, 10 or 11 years old, right, who's out there protesting, and his mother comes out, smacks him in the head, pulls him in the house, right, and she gets celebrated, right, for a particular style of black parenting that then gets tethered to a protest movement. Right, so the narrative becomes like when these young folks are out in the street, Black Lives Matter, that in part is the failure of Black mothers parenting in that context, right? And not a critique, so much that happens to Black families is a critique of the individual failure of parents and not a critique of the way that the state impacts the kind of choices and options that Black parents can make. For me personally, and it's taken me a while to unravel this, the beauty of getting older, and the beauty of this project for me has been that I've had to go deep in my own archive and process some different things. And the narrative of my career has always been, my father had these albums. I listen to these albums and I do this work because of my father's albums. But my mother was also a collector, right? Father collected albums, my mother collected 45s, right? The way that the music sounded in the house, right? And I described this in Black Ephemera. We had two speakers this high in the living room, like mantelpieces. There was a speaker over the cabinet in the kitchen, and then there was a fourth speaker in my parents' bedroom. The apartment is 700 square feet. That soundscape was my mother's design, right? How she wanted to be able to hear music, right? And it's not until I got to this age that I realized her impact emotionally and things like that. Again, I talk about the bookshelf, right? My mother, and I talked about, what she couldn't achieve in her marriage, she achieved in her parenting, right? She started college in the fall of 1982, right? I started college in the fall of 1983, right? When I'm coming back home from school and she's doing night school in the Bronx, right, I find Angela Davis on her bookshelf because she's taking women's studies courses, right? I find Audre Lorde on her bookshelf. She has there's a script in the Essence magazine, right? And this is not the corporate Essence that we know now, but this is the Essence that's publishing public conversations between James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, right? And I'm reading this at 17, 18 years old because this is my mother's reading material. So I think mothers are a really important aspect of this. And part of what I'm trying to negotiate with this project, how do we talk about Black fatherhood, right? And also not demean and also delegitimize the role of Black mothers in that process. Yes, Roger.
Thanks so much for this talk. Really extraordinary. I'm interested in some ways in the scale of the way that you're. Sorry, thanks. I'm interested in the scale of the way that you're talking about things, and I'm partly thinking about this as. On the one hand, a kind of larger infrastructure that something like the Moynihan report actually, not so paradoxically, it turns out creates, right? And then the small gestures, right? Because it seems as if love, in the way that you're describing it, is very much in the small gestures, the moments of attention to the detail, the moment when with all the kind of baggage and frustration that everyone who's been a child or a parent understand, in other words, everyone understands of, the burden of, do I have to care in this way today? Do I have to do this? And then the small moment of hearing your father sing, or Malcolm X inviting his daughter to swirl her sweetness in his coffee. So I was just wondering if you could maybe reflect on the fact that you are sort of reading love in these small moments, and how we come to understand that.
I think I imagined this project initially as about those small gestures. But the small gestures that I know the most come from my own biographical experience, right? And I did not want this because we're in this moment of publishing, and it resonates, I think, for Black intellectuals, Black scholars, where the trade arena wants us to tell stories about ourselves and hopefully, right, connected to broader issues. I didn't want it to be that kind of book. One, because I didn't want to have to expose my family to some of those narratives, right? But I think it's also important to pepper those kind of narratives in the context of this larger story. And for me, it's talking about the ways, without a blueprint on how to parent, you know, being willing enough to allow my daughters to help guide my parenting. Um, because this, kids will tell you what they need. You might not always like to hear it, and don't like to hear it when they choose to tell you, right? But they give you a good indication of what they need from your parents. And I think as fathers, it's far more difficult to avail yourself to that, right? Because you got one job: go out and make some money, right? That's it, and everything else is supposed to fall in place. And that's for me been like the biggest challenge. How do we talk about these small little moments, these gestures that are so important, right? I have to do that with the reminder of that I do so with a certain kind of class privilege, right? I'm a Black professor at an elite institution. My schedule looks different than most other Black fathers, right? So whereas my father couldn't be available to things, I'm available for everything, right? Even at this point now where we have adult children living in different places, if I go visit one of my adult children, right, in my mind, I know I got to go visit the other one. All right. So, this past weekend that meant spending Friday in Salisbury and then going on to Chicago to see the older daughter, right? Not everybody has that kind of privilege, right? And one of the lessons I learned that really is the seeds of this project is because I have been, I won't say a primary caretaker, right? Because, we're joint. But I did all the drop-offs. I'm doing all the pickups and all those kind of things. And seeing other Black fathers. And seeing in my mind a disconnect between who I think I am and wondering who these other Black men are, right? Who clearly don't have the same kind of class privilege and flexibility, professional flexibility than I do. And that forced me to really think about how Black fathers parent across class lines. And so, I opened the second edition, the anniversary edition of New Black Man. I close it with a narrative, a postscript about seeing a couple of young Black men, middle of the day, right? In my head going, why are they walking around in the middle of the day? But then forcing myself to interrogate that scene and imagine, right, that they are fathers who are in relationships who have kids but aren't in relationships with their parents, with the mothers, who at 2 o'clock in the afternoon got some lunch because they're shift workers, work in the evening, went to pick up their kids, take their kids back to their mom's house, cook dinner for them, work with them with their homework until mom comes. Mom comes, they go take their nap, right, to get up and hit that 12 midnight shift. And that narrative is not unusual, right? It's probably more likely. But for American society, thinking about Black fathers, right, those are men that they don't think about, right? So how do those men parent, right? That's really some of the questions I wanted to ask, right? It's easy to talk about how privileged Black men with privilege and financial resources parent. Thank you for that question, Reggie. Yeah.
Mark, I'm curious, what did your father think about your career? And you also shared that your mother went back to school. Did your father ever learn to read?
So I'll start with the second part. One of the things that I lament as a person, and I'll talk about this in the book, is that I never, as a child, developed the instinct to realize that what it was that my father could do. So it was never, I never thought as a child to read to him, right? And for me, that, thinking about that is like the lost opportunity that I had with my father, right? To create a different kind of relationship for us, right? And he would perform reading. He understood the value of reading, and we couldn't do it, right? So still, he would sit in the living room and pretend to read the newspaper, right? Performing that for me, right? And of course, again, as a child, I was unable to pick up on those kinds of signs. As what my father thought, and in many ways, my career, how I do my career is about my father. When I first got my PhD and described writing a book and going out and talking about it, he was the person who intuitively understood what that was. You write this, oh, you got to market it, right? And it was interesting to me that he just kind of picked up on that really quickly. And I decided fairly early in my career that I always wanted to do scholarship, research, and work that my father would find valuable. Right? And not just my father, but folks like my father, right? Working class black people, for which certain things matter to them in a certain kind of way. Music being one of those things, culture being one of those things. I always wanted to do scholarship that I found value in that. And I always take great pride that when I published what the music said in 1997, they were all able to come to like the book launch of that. Right. And for my mother, of course, it's a thing of pride because she's been telling folks for, at that point, 35 years, that's my son, literally saying, that's my son, Mark Anthony Neal. And for my father, it was a different kind of element because he could hear in the work where he was in the work, like, even if it's something that we never talked about. The thing that I often find most amazing about my father, and even goes to some of whatever feminist sensibilities I have, though he would never consider himself a feminist, it was the way that he made space for my mother to be my mother. Right, like I mentioned, she didn't have a filter. She was, my mother's the kind of person that if she was walking into the building right now, you would hear her. Right, I mean, she was 4'11" and and he made space for that, right, and it taught me a lesson, right, on as someone who's been in this household with two daughters and a wife now for 30 some plus years, it taught me how to make space, right, in those places.
That one of those regrets is that you didn't father him, right? As a child, that you didn't father him, right? The reading to him, the this, the that. I mean, it's just an interesting little configuration. But this was really exquisite, and I thank you so much. And please join me in thanking Mark Anthony Neal again.